purpose of this video is to show you what I went through in creating a template for my floor system and for my roof. On the floor, what I had to do was I had to create a cardboard template with which I used to cut out foam board for the bottom layer and then plywood that I put on top of that. In addition, for the roof, I had to basically transfer all of the measurements and placement of objects that I had represented in my CAD drawing to what actually exists on the roof, considering all of the curves associated with that. So this video shows you kind of what I went through in creating those templates. I'd like to explain this technique for creating a template. Now previously I created a template which covers from the wheel wells forward, and now I'm going to create a template which is going to cover the rear part of this floor. And the first thing that you need is a piece of cardboard, that's this, which acts as a surface that you can draw on, and then a piece of butcher paper which you can put pencil marks on. All right, you don't want to mark on the cardboard because you may use it for something else or whatever. The butcher paper you're going to transfer to a large piece of cardboard which covers the entire thing, and on that you're going to mark the template of the whole rear end. Okay, so the first thing to do is to make sure that your cardboard has a straight edge and that your paper also has a straight edge that you lay down on top of it. In this case, the straight edge for the paper in particular has to be located strategically so that you can reference, some part of the van that you want to keep consistent. So for example, I made the straight edge coincide with the point between the back of the left rear wheel and the back of the right wheel well. Okay, so that creates a reference line. Now, in addition, what you want to do is you want to create another couple of marks on the paper which establishes a reference line. And the reference line the reference points that I used for the top half of the floor were all created reference to these two anchor bolt holes. Okay, there are two of them right there. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is to mark on the butcher paper the reference to that anchor bolt hole. Now to do this, I use a level with a marker on here, and this is 24 inches long. So the technique basically is to put that corner right on top of the hole and then draw a line. And it can be anywhere on the paper, okay, but you draw a straight line all the way to the end of the level, all right, and then I write 24 inches, which is the length of that line, and then the reference point, anchor on the passenger side. All right, and I'll do the same thing over here for the other anchor bolt hole, and try to do this as carefully as you can. So there's 24 inches. This is the anchor on the driver's side. Okay, so now that allows me to put that piece of paper onto any arbitrary surface and then know exactly where these points are on that large piece of cardboard. And I'm going to do the same thing for strategic points. So for example, I will create a mark to the forward part of the wheel well. I'll create a mark to the back part of the wheel well. I'll create a mark to the inside of the wheel well. I'll create a mark to this corner right here using the same technique. Now notice it doesn't have to be 24 inches. It could be 13 inches or 12 inches or whatever is convenient. It's best to use as long a line as possible so that you line it up correctly, and then use points closer to the to the actual point that you're templating out. Now conceivably you could do this whole thing on a piece of 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, but you can imagine that 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper would be very, very busy, all right, and you wouldn't be able to see very much, and then, you know, there would be a lot of play. Now, you know, this technique will get you an anchor, a reference point, pretty close. It depends on how carefully you do it. You can get it within, you know, 1/4 of an inch or so. I mean, don't think that you're going to, you know, get down to a 1/16 of an inch accuracy, but with this. However, it's going to do a much better job than you could do by freehanding it. All right, so the idea is I'm going to create a reference point there, and then I'm going to create this back part is curved. Okay, so this is the challenge. You create reference points every 3 or 4 inches along this curve, and then notice right here I've got the latch for the door, so I'm going to need to create a cutout for that latch. So I'll mark that, I'll mark each corner of the latch, etc. And then I'll go all the way around, drawing lines on the paper, until I have my entire template mapped out. Okay, and as I said, in this case, it's important to create a reference point to any previous work you've done. The previous work I did was all reference to this anchor bolt. In fact, I created a template and I put in holes in the template cardboard that I can actually locate it exactly with respect to those anchor bolt holes. And I'll do the same thing here. And then when I go to cutting out the actual template, I'm going to need 2 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of you know, foam board or flooring or whatever I'm going to put down here for this. And I'm going to, you make all necessary notes on your drawing about other elements that you want to locate. So for example, if at this point I know that I want to put a hole someplace in here, then I could do that on the paper also. I'm not going to locate anything like that, I don't think, at this point, but you could do that conceivably. So that's the technique that you use, and you can use the same technique to map out templates of the side of the van and also the ceiling of the van, which is, you know, it's more difficult to do it, but you can nevertheless you can use that same technique, and I will likely do that also. So at least I know I'm going to have to do it for the sides of the van to really capture, you know, that irregular shape of the side of the van. The ceiling I may or may not need to do it. I definitely need to locate these struts though, so I'll probably end up doing it to the ceiling as well. So that's the general approach. So now I've got my paper taped to a big piece of cardboard, and what I'm doing here essentially is transferring those measurements to the big piece of cardboard. Now I'm using a tape rule here. It's not really a very good idea to do that. In fact, later on I started using the level with a true straight edge. But this gives you the idea of what's involved here. And you go and you just go through there and you transfer every single one of those points to your cardboard template, and then you can connect all of those points and then use a knife to cut out a template of the entire floor. Now I'm doing it in 2 sections. I'm doing one for the forward part of the cargo area and one for the backward part of the cargo area. And I'm mapping the same anchor holes using both templates so that I can actually overlay both, or I can put these templates side by side and reference them both to the same anchor holes. Okay, so I showed you how to create a template, and now I want to show you kind of the result of that. Using that template, I was able to create 2 pieces. One is a plywood layer, and one is a 1/2 inch styrofoam insulation layer, which went down on the floor first. And at this point, the reason I've got this little stool here and the blocks of wood is that now I can accurately see if I'm going to hit my head on the ceiling when I sit on a bed or stool that is exactly this height. And I'm satisfied that you know, that I'm not going to have a difficulty with that. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to are these 2-inch bars of aluminum that I have bolted to the floor. Now these are using the holes that are the anchor bolt holes for tie downs that are provided by the manufacturer. Okay, so the idea here is that these bars are bolted firmly to the frame of the van, and now I can essentially bolt my equipment to these bars, and that will make sure that they don't travel all over the place and hopefully represent a solid connection point for all of those pieces of equipment. Basically that's it. I'll just draw your attention. I had to remove the seat, the passenger side seat, and the reason I did that was because I had a dickens of a time, you know, putting a 4x8 sheet of plywood in the van. It wouldn't fit, so I had to remove that seat in order to do that. And what that means is probably the next step in my process is to create the roof rack, because I'm going to need to buy some more 4x8 sheets of foam board and well, mostly foam board, I guess. And I want to be able to tie those to the roof, because it's not easy transporting those inside the van. So things worked out well. Now one thing, it's really important to be careful about your template. And I laid the template down inside of this van many times, and I marked all of the anchor bolt holes, because you know, these are unforgiving. You don't drill another anchor bolt hole, so you need to be able to accurately identify where those anchor bolt holes are, and so you can drill the holes in both your plywood and your foam board and your bars, your 2-inch aluminum bars, so that you can connect to those holes. And one thing I've done is I've left a little gap here. My idea is I'm going to be tucking 1/2-inch fiberboard into the gaps along the side of the van to insulate the walls. So that's what those are for. And so I think I'm ready to move on at this point. The first step I took in creating the roof rack was to build initially the removable frame for the hinged frame for the PV panel, and that's what this aluminum is here. It's made using 2-inch channel, aluminum channel, and then a bar. Okay, now the 2-inch channel, notice that the way it's laid out is that this piece overlaps that piece, so that the PV panel is going to slide into this thing. And I had to use nuts and bolts. I used 2 of them so that I get keep it from racking, you know, otherwise it might hinge on those. And I had to use the nuts and bolts mainly because I first tried a rivet, but the rivet just extended too far down into the 2-inch channel, and I didn't want it to interfere with the PV panel that's sliding in there. So using the nuts and bolts, I was able to use a screw instead of a rivet, and that screw was very it protruded less into the channel. So that's basically why I did that. I could have glued this so that I didn't have any protrusion at all, but to be honest, I didn't want to break out a new glue tube just for that purpose. Now the other thing I did was I laid it out onto the template that I've got, this stencil. That's this huge piece of paper. Now you may be wondering where the heck I got a great big piece of paper like this. And in fact, what I did, one day I was driving around the neighborhood, and I fished it out of somebody's trash because they had delivered to their house one of these giant mirrors. We have one in our house, and these are humongous mirrors, and they come with all kinds of packing paper. And so I was able to scavenge lots and lots of this paper, in addition to a lot of cardboard, large cardboard, which I am using and I'm going to be using for the templates. Now, once I had the paper, I measured it out exactly according to my CAD drawing to make it the exactly correct size. And I also placed my removable or my hinged rack on the template in exactly the point indicated by the CAD drawing. And at that point, the real question is, how does this actually relate to the actual roof? Okay, because the actual roof is curved. It's not exactly flat. And I don't know exactly where these attachment points are going to be. All right, for example, this one and this one. So I didn't have those indicated at this point, but what I was able to do was I actually taped a couple of pieces of aluminum bar to each edge of this big paper, and then I came over to the van and I threw it up on top of the ceiling or the roof of the van. Now, I don't have video of this because this was a pretty delicate process and the wind was blowing and I just couldn't film at the same time that I was doing all this. But basically what I was trying to do was I was trying to locate, you know, these points right here, this one, and there's one over here and two up there. I wanted to locate them exactly on my template because everything that I build with this roof rack and place with the roof rack is going to be referenced to these anchor bolt holes. This is the thing that is critical for the placement of the roof rack on the roof. The other thing that determines in large part, you know, where things are going to be actually located as opposed to where I've indicated them on my CAD drawing is the actual location of the MaxAir fan. So for example, going inside the van, you'll notice that, you know, there's not a lot of choice where it goes. It's going to fit basically between these struts. I'm not going to cut the strut at all for the MaxAir fan. So this determines where the MaxAir fan is going to go, and you know, however that works out on the roof is how I'm going to basically place everything else on the roof rack, because the MaxAir fan has to fit inside the roof rack along with the PV panel. Those are the two major components that have to be placed. Everything else can be placed relative to those two things, but I don't have any choice as to where the MaxAir fan goes. It's got to go in one location, and the PV panel cannot interfere, or the MaxAir fan can't interfere with that PV panel, so that determines where the PV panel is going to be absolutely, even though I've got it drawn the way I've got it drawn, and it's my best estimate. I really need to locate that MaxAir fan before I can do anything else. Now this is roughly where my MaxAir fan is going to go, and it's going to consist of a collar which goes down inside the roof, and then the MaxAir fan sits on top of this collar. And so there are three critical measurements. It's the measurement of this collar inside, which has to fit between those struts that I mentioned before. And then I've got this measurement here, which basically is the hole size that I have to cut in the roof. And then the dimensions of this top piece, which basically represent the geography that the MaxAir fan is going to take on the roof, and I need to know that so that I can place the MaxAir fan so that the PV panel here is going to sit in front of it. And as I said, I've done all of this in CAD, and that's great, except that doesn't necessarily, I've done my best to try to correlate the CAD drawing to the actual van, but it's not easy to do. So one thing that I did was I made cardboard templates of these three pieces. So for example, this cardboard template here is the same size as the dimensions of the MaxAir fan right here. All right, and then what I was able to do is, I don't know if you can see, I can locate the center of this piece and I put a hole there. All right, and then I did the same thing with the whole piece. All right, so then I can, I created it and I put a hole there, and I created a template of the outside perimeter of the top of the MaxAir fan, and I created this template. Now, the idea of this is that, as I indicated, this one is the one that really determines where this MaxAir fan is actually going to be located, because this is the one that has to fit between these struts. Okay, so I need to locate that exactly. Now once I've done that, I can drill a pilot hole through the center of this template. And now I've got a little hole on the roof, and I can put on top of the roof these templates to show exactly where I have to cut, and also where on the roof this MaxAir fan is going to be located. Once I do that, for example, I can go on top of the roof and I can relate, let me get this out of the way. Oh gosh, I'm doing this one hand, I'll probably drop it. All right. Once I do this, I can go on top of the roof and I can relate where these anchor bolt holes are with respect to the actual placement of the MaxAir fan. Okay, and once I've done that, I can come back to this template and I can place this exactly where it actually is on the roof. And then I can and hopefully at that point I can confirm that my PV panel is in the right place. But if it isn't, that's the time to adjust, because all of my measurements for my roof rack are really dependent on the placement of that MaxAir fan and the PV panel. And then everything else towards the front is sort of slack variable. All right. Now one concern is that it hangs too far. It is pretty long, and I'm going to be looking at ways to try to shorten it up whenever possible, but it's very difficult to estimate what that's going to be in CAD, because you'll notice this curvature is something that I'm going to have to create a custom template for eventually, and it's not something that I can easily represent in all of my CAD work of the measurements. But nevertheless, the most important thing is to get everything placed and the dimensions nailed down at the back of the van. So that's where I'm at on that.